There comes a moment when the seeker becomes the cage, when the journey toward wholeness transforms into another labyrinth where the soul wanders, forever promised a destination that recedes with each step. What if the very act of chasing healing has become the wound itself? You know this exhaustion. It lives in the space between your ribs, where breath catches on the weight of another failed transformation. It's the fatigue that comes not from living, but from the endless performance of becoming. You've tried meditation that felt like prison, therapy that became another task, healing modalities that promised to unlock you, yet left you feeling more fractured than before. There's a sacred tiredness that visits those who have walked too long in the desert of self-improvement. Your soul carries the dust of 1,000 attempted resurrections. Each workshop, each retreat, each moment of supposed breakthrough followed by the inevitable return to the familiar ache. You've become an expert in your own woundedness, a scholar of your own suffering. This is not about abandoning the quest for wholeness. This is about recognizing when the quest itself has become the obstacle, when the wounded pilgrim archetype has served its purpose and something deeper calls for recognition. The soul that no longer chases healing doesn't give up on transformation. It discovers that transformation was never something to be caught, but something to be allowed. She had been running toward healing for so long that she had forgotten what stillness felt like. Crystals lined her windowsill like tiny soldiers of hope. Her phone carried the weight of meditation apps, astrology updates, and the endless scroll of spiritual wisdom that never quite touched the core of her loneliness. One evening, as rain traced ancient patterns on her window, she found herself too tired to meditate, too weary for affirmations, too empty for another technique that promised to fill the void. She sat in her chair, not in lotus position, not with intentional breath, not with any spiritual agenda. She simply sat. In that moment of complete spiritual defeat, something shifted. Not healing, not breakthrough, just a quality of presence she had never accessed through trying. The rain became a teacher she had never consulted. The silence spoke a language she had been too busy to learn. Carl Jung spoke of the shadow not as what we must eliminate, but as what we must integrate. In the mythology of healing, we often become warriors against our own darkness, never suspecting that the battle itself feeds what we're trying to defeat. There's an old story about a mirror that showed not your reflection, but your relationship to seeking. Those obsessed with their image saw only distortion. Those who had stopped looking saw themselves clearly for the first time. The mirror revealed a truth that could only be witnessed in surrender. You were never broken. Perhaps you recognize this. The way your body tenses when someone asks about your spiritual practice, the subtle shame that rises when you realize you've been performing awakening rather than living it. The exhaustion that comes from treating your soul like a project with deadlines and measurable outcomes. You may have noticed that the more desperately you reach for peace, the more it seems to slip through your fingers like water. The healing you chase becomes another form of suffering, dressed in the robes of transformation. There's a point on every sacred journey where the pilgrim's body simply stops. Not from lack of faith, but from a deeper wisdom that recognizes when movement becomes avoidance. The bones know something the mind hasn't learned yet. That rest is not the absence of progress, but progress itself. She had been carrying crystals in her pockets for 3 years. Amethyst for clarity, rose quartz for self-love, black tourmaline for protection. They had become familiar weights, companions in her quest for energetic alignment. But on this particular Tuesday, as she reached into her jacket, she realized she had forgotten them all. Walking through the city without her spiritual armor, she expected to feel vulnerable, unprotected. Instead, she felt lighter. The absence of intention created space for something unplanned to arise. A stranger's smile penetrated deeper than any meditation. The way morning light caught in a puddle spoke truths no guru had ever articulated. The polyvagal theory teaches us that the nervous system holds the memory of every unfinished healing. Your body becomes a living archive of spiritual seeking, storing the residue of every practice that promised to save you. The tension in your shoulders carries the weight of trying. The tightness in your chest holds the breath you've been holding, waiting for permission to be whole. Sacred exhaustion is different from ordinary tiredness. It's the fatigue that comes from swimming against the current of your own nature. Your body, in its infinite wisdom, begins to resist the very practices that once brought relief, not because they're wrong, but because they're no longer needed. The vessel is ready for a different kind of fullness. Marion Woodman wrote about the difference between doing and being, between achieving transcendence and inhabiting it. The wounded feminine archetype within us, regardless of gender, has been taught to earn love through becoming. But the soul knows a different language entirely. When exhaustion finally claims the seeker, something else can emerge. Not the transcendent light we've been reaching for, but the embodied presence we've been stepping over in our rush toward enlightenment. The mystic doesn't ascend beyond the human experience. The mystic discovers the sacred within it. In the depths of the psyche lives an archetype Jung might have called the keeper of wounds, a part of us that has become so identified with brokenness that healing feels like death. This inner figure whispers in the language of self-sabotage, ensuring that just as breakthrough approaches, something pulls us back into familiar suffering. He had been in therapy for 7 years, not because he wasn't making progress, but because progress terrified him in ways he couldn't name. Each time his therapist suggested they might be nearing a natural completion, he would discover new traumas, deeper layers, more complex patterns that needed attention. The truth he couldn't face was simpler than any of his elaborate psychological constructions. He had no idea who he would be without his wounded identity. The healing journey had become his primary relationship, his source of meaning, his explanation for everything that felt difficult about being human. What if your deepest fear isn't that you'll never heal, but that you will? What if the unconscious mind, in its mysterious protectiveness, keeps you wounded because wholeness feels like annihilation of the self you've learned to be? This is what James Hillman called the soul's preference for pathology, not because suffering is good, but because the wounded soul has developed an intimacy with pain that feels safer than the unknown territory of wellness. The familiar ache becomes a compass, a way of navigating a world that feels too big, too bright, too demanding of presence. We live in a culture that has turned healing into a commodity and woundedness into currency. Your trauma story becomes your brand. Your recovery becomes your purpose. The wounded healer archetype, meant to be a temporary station on the journey towards service, becomes a permanent residence. But the soul knows the difference between healing that integrates and healing that perpetuates. True healing doesn't give you more to talk about. It gives you less need to explain. It doesn't make you special. It makes you ordinary in the most extraordinary way. Even self-sabotage serves the soul's mysterious intelligence. Every time you pull back from breakthrough, every time you choose the familiar pain over unknown wellness, some part of you is saying, "Not yet." You're not ready to let go of what this suffering is teaching you. The invitation isn't to override this resistance, but to dialogue with it, to ask the part of you that clings to woundedness, what are you protecting? What would you lose if I became whole? What gift are you trying to preserve that you fear wholeness might dissolve? Silence isn't the absence of communication, it's the soul's native tongue. In a world addicted to noise, to progress, to the constant narration of experience, the soul often must withdraw completely to be noticed, like a shy animal that only approaches when the forest becomes utterly still. Your anxiety may not be a problem to be solved, but a smoke signal from a soul that has been trying to get your attention through whispers and is now forced to shout. The panic attacks, the sleepless nights, the sudden waves of inexplicable sadness. What if these aren't symptoms of something broken, but messages from something that refuses to be ignored any longer? She had been in conversation with healers, therapists, spiritual teachers, and well-meaning friends for 2 years. Everyone had an interpretation of her pain, a technique to try, a perspective that might unlock her mystery. She had become fluent in the language of healing, able to analyze her patterns with sophisticated psychological terminology, but the more she talked about her experience, the further she felt from it. The words created distance between her and her own life, turning lived experience into case study, sacred wound into spiritual data. One day, in the middle of a session with her energy worker, she simply stopped talking, not out of resistance or anger, but from a deeper recognition that words had become another barrier. In the silence that followed, something else began to speak, not through concepts or insights, but through sensation, through presence, through a quality of being she had forgotten she possessed. Rollo May suggested that anxiety often emerges when the soul is ready for an expansion that the personality isn't prepared to handle. What we label as disorder might be the soul's awkward attempt at breakthrough, like a snake trying to shed skin that has become too tight. Your nervous system, overwhelmed by spiritual forcing, begins to create symptoms that demand you slow down, turn inward, stop the relentless pursuit of transcendence long enough to inhabit your actual life. The body, in its infinite wisdom, creates conditions that make seeking impossible, forcing a different kind of attention. True listening isn't about hearing messages from guides or accessing psychic information. It's about developing the capacity to be present with what is, without the compulsion to change, fix, or transcend it. This kind of listening is a discipline, a practice more rigorous than any meditation technique, because it requires the death of the spiritual ego. When you listen to your body without trying to decode its messages, something shifts. When you feel your emotions without rushing to understand their meaning, they begin to transform on their own. The soul doesn't need your management, it needs your presence. There comes a moment, impossible to predict, impossible to force, when the entire edifice of seeking simply collapses. Not gradually, not through insight or breakthrough, but suddenly, like a building that has been hollowed out from within, finally surrendering to gravity. This isn't depression, though it may wear depression's clothes. This isn't giving up, though it feels like surrender. This is what the mystics called the dark night of the soul, but not the romantic, transformative darkness that spiritual literature often describes. This is the dark night that doesn't promise dawn, doesn't whisper of hidden gifts, doesn't offer itself as another stage in your development. Her apartment had become a museum of attempted transformation. Singing bowls from Tibet gathered dust beside unused journal prompts. Essential oils, their potency faded, stood in neat rows like tiny soldiers of a war she had forgotten she was fighting. The meditation cushion, once sacred, now felt like evidence of failure. She couldn't pinpoint when the shift occurred. Maybe it was the morning she woke up and felt nothing toward her spiritual practice, not resistance, not enthusiasm, just a profound absence of caring. The pursuit that had defined her for years suddenly felt as foreign as a language she had never learned. In that emptiness, stripped of identity as seeker, student, work in progress, something else began to emerge, not healing, not breakthrough, not the enlightenment she had been chasing. Just ordinary presence unmarked by spiritual significance, unadorned by meaning. The soul's exhaustion isn't a sign of spiritual failure. It's an initiation into a different kind of relationship with existence. When the seeking stops, not because you found what you were looking for, but because the search itself has become unbearable, you discover something that was never lost. This is what Hildegard of Bingen might have called green grace, the natural vitality that emerges when we stop trying to manufacture it, like a garden left to its own devices, returning to wild abundance after years of overcultivation. The void that appears when spiritual seeking collapses isn't empty the way we imagine emptiness. It's pregnant with potential that has no name, no direction, no promise of becoming anything other than what it is. This emptiness doesn't long to be filled. It reveals itself as fullness, wearing the mask of absence. Your entire healing journey may have been preparation for this moment of not seeking, not because seeking was wrong, but because the soul needed to exhaust every external avenue before recognizing what had been present all along. The sacred operates by laws that the healing-seeking mind cannot comprehend. What can be grasped, measured, and achieved belongs to the realm of the ego. What appears in surrender operates by different principles entirely. It arrives not as reward for spiritual work, but as recognition of what was always present beneath the work. This is why every authentic mystical tradition speaks of paradox. You find God by giving up the search for God. You discover yourself by forgetting yourself. You heal by accepting what feels unhealable. The invisible reveals itself only to those who have stopped trying to make it visible. There's a Sufi story about a man who spent his life searching for a key to unlock the door to divine mystery. He traveled to distant lands, studied with renowned teachers, performed elaborate practices designed to make him worthy of receiving this key. On his deathbed, exhausted from decades of seeking, he reached toward the door one final time, not to unlock it, but simply to lean against it in his weariness. The door had never been locked. Every spiritual tradition carries this same recognition. What we seek through effort reveals itself through surrender, not because surrender is another technique, but because surrender dissolves the seeker who was blocking what they sought. The spiritual warrior, the part of you that has been battling shadows, conquering fears, defeating limitations, has served its purpose. This archetype carries the energy of transformation through will, effort, and directed intention. But there comes a time when the warrior must lay down arms, not in defeat, but in recognition that the war was never real. The mystic archetype emerges from this laying down. The mystic doesn't seek transcendence. The mystic recognizes transcendence as the very ground of ordinary experience. The mystic doesn't pursue unity. The mystic inhabits the unity that was never actually broken. Control, even spiritual control, creates tension in the field of experience. When you're trying to manage your energy, direct your thoughts, manifest your desires, some essential part of life's natural intelligence is held at bay. Release the grip of spiritual management, and something else begins to animate your experience. This isn't passive resignation, it's active receptivity. Like a musician who stops trying to force the music and allows the song to play itself through them, the melody was always there, waiting for the performer to stop interfering with its expression. Your symptoms may not be problems to be solved, but messages from a deeper intelligence trying to redirect your attention. The migraine that appears every time you force yourself into meditation, the insomnia that arrives when you're pushing too hard toward breakthrough, the anxiety that rises whenever you're performing spirituality rather than living it. What if your body has been functioning as an oracle all along, speaking in the language of sensation to communicate what your mind couldn't hear? Not all pain is pathology. Sometimes pain is the soul's way of saying, this isn't your path, this isn't your pace, this isn't your way. She had been fighting chronic fatigue for 3 years, interpreting it through every possible lens: adrenal burnout, candida overgrowth, electromagnetic sensitivity, ancestral trauma patterns. Each diagnosis offered temporary hope, each treatment temporary relief, but the exhaustion always returned, often stronger than before. The turning point came not through another healing protocol, but through a moment of complete surrender to the fatigue itself. Instead of fighting it, she began to listen to it. Instead of medicating it, she began to dialogue with it. The exhaustion, she discovered, had been trying to tell her something her achievement-oriented mind couldn't hear. Slow down, rest, stop trying to earn your existence through productivity. When she finally honored what the fatigue was asking for, true rest, not just physical but spiritual and emotional, something shifted, not healing in the way she had been expecting, but a deeper alignment with rhythms she had been overriding for decades. Indigenous traditions recognize that some souls are called to become healers through their own initiation into suffering. The wounded healer doesn't transcend pain, but learns to read its symbolic language, to understand illness as communication from the invisible world. Your depression might be the soul's way of taking you underground, into necessary darkness that our light-obsessed culture doesn't value. Your anxiety might be hypersensitivity to energies that need witnessing, not medicating. Your addiction might be a misguided attempt at transcendence that contains the seed of authentic mystical longing. This doesn't mean you should remain sick, but rather that you might discover healing by honoring what your symptoms are protecting or pointing toward instead of simply trying to eliminate them. There's a phenomenon that medical professionals rarely discuss, the symptom that disappears not through treatment, but through acceptance, the pain that dissolves when you stop fighting it, the anxiety that transforms when you stop trying to manage it, the depression that lifts when you stop trying to think your way out of it. This isn't about positive thinking or denial. It's about discovering that some forms of suffering are maintained by our resistance to them. When the fight ends, the opponent often has no reason to stay. Pain, from the soul's perspective, often serves as a teacher. It breaks open what needs to be opened, dissolves what needs to be dissolved, redirects attention toward what has been ignored. But, like any good teacher, pain withdraws when the lesson has been integrated, when the soul has learned what it came to learn. This doesn't happen through understanding or insight alone. It happens through embodied recognition, through cellular-level shifts in how you relate to existence itself. The soul that has been trying to get your attention through suffering suddenly finds other ways to communicate. He had been carrying grief for his father's death for 7 years. The grief had become his companion, his connection to love, his proof that their relationship had mattered. He went to grief counselors, participated in support groups, practiced rituals designed to help him process and move through his loss. The breakthrough came not through processing, but through recognition. He had been holding on to grief because letting it go felt like betraying his father's memory. The pain had become a form of love, a way of keeping connection alive. One morning, while sitting with a photo of his father, he felt the grief transform, not disappearing, but changing quality, from desperate clinging to grateful remembrance, from wound to wisdom, from pain that demanded attention to love that simply was. In archetypal terms, there comes a moment when the wounded child within you graduates to become the inner elder. This isn't about age, it's about wisdom earned through experience, compassion developed through suffering, authority gained through surrendering the need to be right. The elder doesn't reject the wounded parts, but holds them with tenderness. The elder doesn't try to heal the past, but integrates it as sacred history. The elder doesn't seek transformation, but becomes the space in which transformation naturally occurs. Not all pain is chronic. Some suffering comes with its own expiration date, designed to break you open to specific recognitions before departing. The soul that has been using depression to slow you down suddenly allows energy to return. The anxiety that was protecting you from dangerous choices begins to fade as you develop better boundaries. This doesn't mean you've conquered these experiences or that they'll never return. It means you've learned to read their symbolic language, to understand what they're asking for, to respond to their deeper communication instead of just managing their surface symptoms. Who are you when you're not broken? Who are you when you're not seeking? Who are you when you're not in process, not becoming, not working on yourself? This question can feel terrifying to souls who have built their entire identity around transformation, but it's the question that leads to authentic living. The end of the healing journey isn't marked by perfection or enlightenment, it's marked by ordinariness. The extraordinary ordinariness of being human without apology, without the constant need to improve or transcend, or become something other than what you are. She had spent years working on her relationship with abundance, attending workshops on manifestation, clearing blocks to receiving, aligning her energy with prosperity consciousness. The harder she worked on abundance, the more elusive it became. The more techniques she learned for attracting wealth, the more aware she became of her lack. The shift happened when she stopped trying to manifest and started simply living. She noticed beauty she had been too busy visualizing to see. She received gifts she had been too focused on attracting to notice. She discovered that abundance had been present all along, hidden beneath the noise of trying to create it. The mind that has been trained to analyze every experience for spiritual significance begins to relax its grip. Not every dream needs interpretation. Not every synchronicity needs explanation. Not every emotion needs processing. Sometimes experience can simply be experienced, without the overlay of meaning-making that turns life into curriculum. This is what embodied spirituality looks like: presence without purpose, awareness without agenda, consciousness without the compulsion to do something with it. The sacred becomes so ordinary it stops feeling sacred, and in that ordinariness reveals its true nature. When the compulsion to seek dissolves, a different quality of energy becomes available. The energy that was bound up in searching, striving, reaching toward some imagined future version of yourself suddenly has nowhere to go but into this moment, this breath, this ordinary experience of being alive. You discover that presence doesn't require practice. It requires the cessation of practices that take you out of presence. Joy doesn't need to be cultivated. It needs the obstacles to joy removed. Love doesn't need to be learned. It needs the barriers to love dissolved. At the end of every authentic spiritual journey is the same recognition. What you were seeking was never missing. The peace you tried to attain through meditation was present beneath the effort to meditate. The love you sought to cultivate was the very ground from which seeking arose. The wholeness you chased through healing was the wholeness that was capable of feeling fragmented in the first place. This isn't a philosophical concept. It's a lived recognition that changes everything while changing nothing. You're still human, still inhabiting the same body, still navigating the same challenges. But the relationship to all of it shifts from problem-solving to presence, from becoming to being, from search to recognition. True healing isn't about fixing what's broken or transcending what's human. It's about returning to what was never actually lost: your essential nature, your inherent wholeness, your natural capacity for presence and love and simple being. Like Dorothy discovering she had the power to go home all along, like the prodigal son realizing he was never actually exiled, like the wave discovering it was never separate from the ocean. Healing is recognition, not achievement. The most radical spiritual practice for souls exhausted by seeking might be the practice of not practicing, the discipline of ordinary living, the commitment to presence without purpose. This doesn't mean becoming passive or uncreative or unconscious. It means allowing your natural intelligence to move through you without the overlay of spiritual management. It means trusting that consciousness knows how to be conscious without your help. If you've heard this message, you're ready for the end of seeking, not because you've achieved some level of spiritual attainment, but because your soul is tired of the performance and ready for the truth that you were never broken, the truth that presence was never missing, the truth that the peace you've been seeking has been seeking you with equal intensity. The invitation is simple. Stop chasing what you already are. Stop trying to heal what was never actually damaged. Stop searching for what has been present all along, waiting patiently beneath the noise of spiritual ambition. In this stopping, something else begins. Not a new journey, not another level of development, not a higher state of consciousness. Just this, the extraordinary ordinariness of being human, fully present, finally home. Before you sleep tonight, try this small ritual. Place your hand on your heart and simply acknowledge, I am already whole. not as affirmation or positive thinking, but as recognition of what has always been true. Feel what shifts in your body when you stop trying to become and start allowing yourself to simply be. The soul that no longer chases healing discovers what healing was always pointing toward. The peace that exists prior to problems, the love that doesn't need to be earned, the wholeness that was never actually fragmented, only dreaming it was broken so it could experience the joy of remembering its true nature. What you seek is what you are. What you are is what has always been seeking you.